psychological. So I was teaching in the University of Milan. So I'm majorly doing the research, working with the clinics. So about some intervention of psychologists. Now today I add a little title for my. So the title, as you can see, it's as you can see. So today I'm going to tell you, everyone, a little small pieces that I will take care of. Maybe exaggerated, but when we talk about integrative medicine, it is something that's relevant to my part. So that I'm going to talk about is the big connection between all the systems all the systems, the big connection between systems and the environment and psychology and biology. So, I would like to use this method. So, from the complexity of the science. So, as we can see, the disease or the healthy is the emergent property of our body. So, okay, so now we can see it clearly. So this is a property, emergent property of adaptive and dynamic and complex system. So this system is actually very dynamic. It changes all the time, and it can be adopt different situation and different change. So as we can know, the healthy is actually a result of a process. They are not. Sometimes we don't understand the changement. So we have to understand every little element. And then, so what kind of method that we are using for the research? Sometimes we use the traditional way. So for me, it's difficult to amplify and to give evidence of all kind of evidence the disease. So to understand how much is complex of this system. So now we can see from this chart, they give us some different elements of our life environment. This is a system, but it's just one level. So as you can see, the reality is much more vast. So there's so many different systems that interconnect to each other. So we can see the organism, or the nature. So there is a bigger system, the community, the society. So we have a small system. So each one is belongs to a bigger system. So as you can see, there are some systems as well. So each one is composed by or influenced by different small subsystems. So for example, our hormones and proteins. So those are the elements that to compose the system. So we can understand from the interaction of different systems. And from this level, we will understand. But we have to take into consideration of the interaction of all kinds of levels of these different systems. So it's if we consider only the single parts, we will not have a whole picture of the disease. So that's actually a result of every element that connects to each other. So in this case, we will see even the cancer, they have emergent phenomena. So there is actually So we need to know that it's actually the combination, the result of combination of external and internal factors. So as we can see, it's a one disease, but with much more factors, much more elements that composed it. So those ways or methods that we can use to analyze so as our psychologists so everyone know that we have the psychoneuroendocrine immunology, so it's the PNEY. As psychologists, today we already know about this. This is the discipline that it's by literal to tell us. So it's actually the methods that connect to the psychology and the neurology. So and also the environment is missing in here. But this is a new concept that because we know the study that we are having, the research we are having in this aspect is not so much, it's only an emergent field. So they only started about 10 years ago. But lately, there is a fusion of this approach. So the things that interesting us is that because we actually for my discipline, for my study, we are trying to understand what's the psychological factor that influence our immune system. So what are the changements that terminate from the psychological field to help us to understand what kind of the factor that will cause cancer. So there's so many evidence to show us that there's so many psychological factors influence the cause of cancer and the tumor, and also give the influence on the development of cancer. So there are so many factors that will actually have a huge impact on the development of cancer, such as stress. So this is actually the title of my presentation, and in particular, we also know the psychological factor also have a very important impact on the answer of our patients. So when we are talking about what kind of approach we can use to cure the cancer, so those are actually the factors we have to take into consideration. So when we're doing the diagnosis of the cancer, those are the factors we have to take into consideration. There are also a series of the reaction, the chain factors. So from the activation, so every factor actually linked to each other to give this reaction. So and all of them, they will actually can produce the neural resistance. So for us as a psychologist, what is more and most important and interesting is that during our childhood, is there a period of life that they will bring us a specific reaction that will impact our adult life. So this, if we live in a stressful environment from very young age, so in the long run, during the adult life, these individuals who has a difficult childhood will actually show that they have they will have this increase of the cancer hormones. So in a small micro environment, actually they can trigger the cancer cellulars. So, which means, what do we mean microenvironment? Do you know what is the microenvironment? We know, but we have to see the notes actually. When we are talking about everything is around the cellular. So the problem is that the microenvironment is in a stressful situation. When we talk about this morning, when we talk about there's an increase of inflammation, that means your environment is very stressful. So these are actually all the elements. Actually, if you live in a stressful environment, this environment will eliminate all the the nutrition for the cellular. So, what could we do? Or we change, or we die. So, in this case, we have to say, in our life, we have to change. Because it's not stupid to say that I want to survive. So, what we can do in this case, and so we have to change the environment for survival. Then we have to transform. We have to adapt the situation. We have to cure the cellular. So in this case, then we have see the next case. Now, these are the example and the position of that stress will cause the change of our expression of medicine. So these are the when someone contact with a stressful situation, it's like a chain reaction. They will produce different substances for the stressful that we have already heard today. So we will later tell you into the details. Actually, this situation will influence your gene, and so they will actually modify your cellular. So from the oncological point of view, they actually will cause the increase of the cancer cellular. So and adrenaline is actually can help us to increase the expression. The high level of adrenaline actually help us to increase the sometimes it will help the cancer to develop. So sometimes they will
So going back to the first matter of the title, stress response. The stress response in any case is about two main ways. The first, the classical way that we all know, hypothalamus, hypophysis, and surrenal, which is the chemical way, which activates the CTH, which activates the cortex of the surrenal gland, which activates the cortisol, which impacts on the immune system with a series of responses. For example, just for coherence with what you heard today, with responses anti-inflammatory or pro-inflammatory, morte cellulare che è naturale e benvenuta se la cellula non which impacts the death of the cell if it's not useful anymore for the life of the organism. Anyway, all these phenomena are useful for the life of the organism if the immune system works well. On the other side, we will see after that actually if there is an imbalance in the functioning of the axis hypothalamus surrenal, which means too much cortisol in a continuative way and chronicle, then the activation of the immune system, which is continually activated, can become dysfunctional. The other way is the nervous way, which is about an inflammation from the nervus oculus and the nerves of the peripheral nervous system, which produce adrenaline, which affect also the behavioral system. Why is this important? Well, we already heard that, so it's about stress and the connection with the immune system. A stressful event, what does it mean for the body, a stressful event? It activates these two ways, which activate the immune system, which activates a behavior which could activate or inhibit these responses. From an oncological point of view, a chronic stress or a trauma which it didn't resolve, which is very important for us. For the psychologist means a stress that contains to be present, keeps to be present in the present. It continues to activate the response to the stress. So they activate the two ways of response to the stress with cortisol, adrenaline and noradrenaline responses. So without going into details, we go to the bottom. So what do they lead to? An increase in cancer probability and an increase in the likelihood of having metastasis thanks through an increase of the inflammation. So what can we make out of this? That we have to manage our stress. In any case, the starting point, if we should put a big cross on chronic stress. So I go back to the big connection. Connection for me is a magic word which I discovered in the last years, and I'm not leaving it. I put it everywhere. Everywhere I can put it, I put the big connection. And again, we go back on the concept of individual, which is in between bigger things and smaller things. And so this individual is made up of a microenvironment, which can be good, but also not adapted to the survival. A good microenvironment can be something that gives me substances to maintain myself in balance on all my microenvironments or not. So the microenvironment becomes dysfunctional if it has chronic inflammation, which leads to an increase in the probability of tumor. When we talk about microenvironment, we have physical microenvironment, so the context in which we live in, urban areas, rural area, the house we live in, but also with all the factors related to the physical environment, but also the social environment, which is one of the aspects for us that is really interesting. Because the social environment can really determine the stress response, and so the microenvironment. Now, we talked about social environment. There are some conditions that influence negatively the cellular microenvironment. And concerning the macro environment, there are some adverse social conditions, and these are the most studied ones. So people with a low socio-economical status and people that live isolated. People that have had a diagnosis of chronic disease such as tumor, or traumas after treatment for some chronic disease. These are all conditions which are social conditions that are defined as adverse. An happening that is considered to be adverse can be either real or imagined, but once I move away from the danger, the stress response diminishes and you go back to normality. The problem is that I find myself today in this situation, but now, today, day to day becomes the tomorrow, which is the same, and the day after again, which is still the same, and so on, for, I don't know, months, years, and it becomes a chronic condition, and adverse, which leads, as we said, to an activation of the stress response, starting from cortisol, which triggers a waterfall of events, of physiological and chemical activations of the immune system, which will always be triggered to fight the chronic situation. So what happens is, this is a very interesting article from Stephen Coben. It defines a profile of response to the adverse social conditions, chronic. A response profile characterized by an increase of the pro-inflammatory genes. So if I am subject to a continuous chronic event, then it's a subtle inflammation of low grade that I always keeping with myself. So, summing it up, we have social adverse conditions, perceived or actual, which is very important, because this can say to us that there could be a threat outside, so I can fight it. For the immune system, it could be a bacterium, and so it activates, and there is the bacterium, and I fight it, and the bacterium is dead, and the immune system turns off, and we go back to the balance that we heard about many times today. Or it could also be just perceived, and we can see, we will see now why perceived. What does it mean? Maybe there isn't an actual threat outside a bacterium that we need to fight, but there is the perception of the potential threat, which is just psychological. And here we go into the more psychological part. Koban describes the self in context, which is the person in his context, but specifically the conception that the individual has of itself and of itself in relation to the world. Fundamentally, who am I? How much am I worth? What is my role in the world? How do others consider myself? What can I do in the world? And so, through this conception of myself in the world, I attribute significance and importance to the events that I'm living. So, even a threat that is neutral. I have a little bit of difficulty with the microphone. I don't know if you realized it. This is a source of stress. So it could be a neutral event, but it depends on how I live it, if it's really neutral or not. So speaking here in public, for myself, I'm a little bit shy, it's a bit difficult, and it's a source of stress. But if I need to do it for work, I go back to home, I can do a shower and relax, and my immune system goes down. But if I do it for work, and if I can't change my role as a person that is doing something in the world, and I get stressed, you become a threat for myself, for what I think about myself. And if this happens every day, then there will be an imbalance, an activation, which leads to an increase in the inflammatory of the immune system. And in particular, he says with an activation in favor of the immune system, which are in this favor of the circuit TH1, which is implied in the fight against tumoral cells. And I find this really interesting. And so a really important aspect involved in this is the self in context, which means how I perceive myself in the world. This model is really interesting. Sorry, I didn't really check what time I began. Nobody checked. So, the self-in-context model allows to access the information about through the information that I gather about myself in the world, I can find a way to interact with the word and find out what happens if I act in a certain way or in another way, in another context, and so on. And so is a model that allows oneself to predict what will happen. And so it guides my behavior and the physiological responses and regulations. Why does it also regulate the physiological responses? Because if I assume that you're all a threat to me, then I will activate a stress response. If I assume that you are an opportunity and collaborators that together, even if I have a different role, we can create something together, then it doesn't become a threat anymore, but the physiological response, given my model of myself in the world, would be to not have fear. So it would be, it will have some effects different from stress responses, so maybe serotonin release. So going back to the physiological response, the distressors, that means the events that can cause a stress response, are fundamentally threats, conceptual. So the interesting part is that it's not actual threats, but conceptual threats. And they depend on the capacity of the individual to interpret them in a coherent way with their actual state. So the critical part from my point of view, these conceptualizations, that is defining a certain event or a stressor, by definition stressor, I don't know, for somebody which is not familiar with stress and stress response, the stressor for definition doesn't have a particular connotation, negative or positive. It can be either positive or negative. So a wedding, for example, in general for the bride is a positive stressor. She's happy, euphoric, but it pawns a physiological response, strong. The future husband culturally will be more of a negative stressor in general. So what I'm saying is that well, this is coherent with what's written in this slide. I attribute significance to the events depending on the culture of reference. Words transmit significance, meaning, and they help building a concept of myself in the world. These conceptualizations, and in particular the threat, are defined socially, hence they contribute to communicate the risks, which means the people with whom I share experiences of life, I also share the concept of threat with. This is very interesting because it tells us that the risk factors that we are talking about now are modifiable, because I can change the significance, the meaning that I attribute to a certain event. And I can change how the others perceive a certain event as a threat or not. If I can change it, I can change the company, the people. I choose a different circle of friends, of collaborators that are less inclined to communicate and transmit a concept. a meaning, a significance of events that it's a threat. I don't go too much into detail with this, but this is the scheme that Koban shows us when he talks about self in context. There are some elements that you have already heard about in this day, during this day. So last evening we were talking about an important network, which is the default mode network. The self in context, these models seem related to the default mode network, which intuitively it's quite logical. It's quite logic. Because if the default mode network it's a cerebral a brain network which is the monkey brain, so jumping around and going around things. It's comprehensible that the default mode network is what allows oneself to build a schema of myself, of who am I in the world. Because inner dialogue and repetition of the inner dialogue is not bad in itself, because it helps a person to build the identity of oneself, and it's really important, especially in growing up in childhood. So, you know, fixating the word that I learned today as a child. So the default mode network allows me to build mental models that can be either functional or dysfunctional. The other interesting aspect is that they allow me to make differences on the future. So we have already seen this kind of aspects. These models allow me to shape my beliefs, to remember, to learn, and are influenced by the social context. The other interesting part, so here we have the self in context, and the context is really important. It's determined by how I process it, and how my default mode network schematizes it in my memory, and it allows me to predict future states of the world. And based on the future predictions that I have on the world, I can choose what behavior to adopt. Another important aspect related with the self in context is the proprioceptive part. I skip this. We have also already seen this. From the biological point of view, the self in context can be collocated in what we were talking about before, the default mode network. And the concept of interoception is important for the context that we are in. Interoception is the process that allows me to be aware. Actually, by definition, interoception sees a more aware part and a part that is less aware, but fundamentally is the part of perceptions and a process of integrations of the perception coming from the body, which tell me what is my state. And so according to the state in which I am now and the context in which I am in, this interoceptive process tells me how should I behave to keep the balance, a balance that allows me to survive with a state of well-being. So also the interoception allows me to predict what is going to happen, given a certain feeling, perception that I have in a certain moment. So if my heart starts beating really fast in front of 50 people, it means I am using the process of interoception to understand where am I in a certain context and what potentially will happen, and so decide what to do, fight or flight. My therapist says that I have to face things, and so I use my interoception to say that I'm actually working on what my therapist is telling me. So interoception can be an accurate process, or it can be a bit more distorted. This is an example that shows us. Do you see I am having a bit of difficulty seeing the brain? But yes, there is brain. This is an example of what are the brain areas that are implied in the interoception. And in particular, these areas are into the arousal of the physiological and cardiovascular responses. So these areas in particular are the ones of the default mode network, which is the one where we use with the monkey mind. Actually, these elements, so the activation of the default of the autonomous system with a high physiological activation, with a negative bias of the event, with the activation of these brain areas, leads me to a state of that can help me in the short term. For example, an anxious state, which can help me and keeps me alert, but in the long run can consume too many resources. I'm going towards the end. In fact, according to how I interpret the physiological changes, which somehow are decided by my self in context that I created based on previous experiences, I can be guided through by models of the self in context that are dysfunctional, which are brought by a lack of awareness. Many of my patients, I have more women than men patients, when we ask them, what do you feel on a physical level? And they don't understand the question, they can't answer the question. So there's a tendency in having a low interoceptive awareness. But there can also be an excessive activation of the perception of the physiological signals, but focalized on certain aspects, but distorted and with a certain bias and interpretation, a negative interpretation of the events. So, which leads to an increase of the attention towards external stimuli. So, to conclude, we have seen the psychological factor, the stressful event, which can be mostly interpreted as stressful, which activates the stressful response, which activates and stimulates the immune system. And so this all tells us that we should decrease the stress stimulus. So what we have seen is that it's really important to work on the self-context, that is the concept that we have of ourselves in relation to the world, which will influence our brain networks, which in turn will solidify or change the concept that we have of ourselves in the world. And this scheme somehow tells us that the prefrontal cortex is the most implied in the default mode network that we talked about before. And interestingly, it works directly on the hypothalamus. So if I work on myself in context of the perception of myself in the world, I work on the prefrontal cortex, which will work on the on the hypophysis axis. So I work on the self in context, but I won't go into details on this. We already have a lot of body-mind disciplines, and in this case you have a figure of a Qigong practitioner, simply because it's one of the disciplines that I like the most. But Qigong, as we saw already, other body-mind disciplines affect the waterfall that we talked about today. In this systematic review, we see how the psychoneuro immunological have an important effect and of great meaning on the reduction of the stress and on an increase of the quality of life and biological markers and biological response to the stress. We see a decrease in the release of cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine, and it's a natural killer of the. And so, to conclude, I leave you with I wish you a flexible, free, and self-in context toward flexible, free, and good journey towards your self-in context, free of constraints, free from expectations of others and of yourself, and so mostly free from how oneself is today, and so flexible.
First of all, thank you very much. When I was working in academia, we couldn't